Good morning, everyone. This is another episode of British and American Culture. Today we are going to finish off chapter 4. But before we do that, I would like to make sure you recognize that next week we will resume quizzes. So next Thursday at 10 a.m. there will be quiz number 4. Same format as before, 10 questions, 1 point each. You need to log on through the CNU portal and access the Google form that I've created. And as soon as you're finished the quiz, just submit it. Don't worry about the timer on the CNU portal. I've said this many times now that this is not important, just that the form is submitted before the deadline comes up. Otherwise, you get a 0. So just focus on the quiz once you log in. And you have to send it before 10 minutes are up. Don't send it in the 10th minute, right at the end of the 10th minute, or you risk not handing it in at all. And of course, you can't submit a form twice. That's not allowed. So just complete the quiz and then submit it, and everything will be fine. We have to go back, before we finish off chapter 4, we have to go back. I skipped over because of time constraints and because this is sort of a new addition to the class that I added when I wrote the 3rd edition this summer. I decided to include some of the intellectuals who are really important to British and American culture. Both of them were affected very profoundly from certain people. And I don't have time to talk about everyone. But we did talk about Shakespeare, Milton, Spencer, Johnson, that generation of writers, poets and writers and dramatists who influenced English culture and helped it develop into what we recognize as British culture today. Likewise, at the end of the 17th century, there was sort of a group of intellectuals that started to tackle science and philosophy in a new way. And certainly they benefited from the experimentation of writers in the poetic forms, but they applied those ideas to that Renaissance humanism, that Protestant effort to question and analyze and understand from an individual perspective, to test things and experiment beyond what the medieval culture relied on with the chain of being and how things were organized. So clearer visions of this way that we normally approach things, that these days sometimes they get questioned and rejected by people who still think the earth is flat and that science is not a certainty, it's just a theory. There are people like that now, but the number of people that are like that now is a small minority compared to what it was like 500 years ago. Everybody thought that you just had to believe and feel and understand the world from sort of a cosmic perspective that was very spiritual. And certain individuals did a lot to change the way that we think about the world and ground it in experimentation, testing, observation, calculation. These are very modern ideas. The two people I would like to talk about first are John Locke and Isaac Newton. In the book, John Locke comes first on page 121 and followed by Isaac Newton, but I would like to talk about Isaac Newton first because Isaac Newton was a scientist, a British scientist who we all know discovered gravity, or recognized that how gravity worked, and made a famous formula to calculate the effect of gravity. And his influence is global. But John Locke, besides the fact that eventually his ideas would be global, specifically affected how American culture decided to develop itself. So let's talk about Isaac Newton first. Isaac Newton was the son of a farmer. And this is another thing that makes him distinct from the type of people who would have led society and made discoveries and influenced culture in the past. At the not the very bottom of the chain of being, but towards the bottom of it, normally you wouldn't have been able to rise to the top of the chain the way he did. I mean, the chain is broken at this point. There's not a chain in a hierarchy. Basically, it's starting to flatten out so that somebody could rise from the lower class and become important enough that every powerful person in Europe recognized his influence. That really was very, very rare. And he was not just famous after his death, he was famous across Europe in his lifetime. So from those humble beginnings, he rose to become one of the greatest intellectuals of the 17th century. He harnessed the powers of the universe, which he didn't really understand, and neatly packaged them into a formula. He was the first mathematician to become a knight. Again, this is evidence that the chain of being is broken down, because you couldn't be a knight unless you were a noble before. Certainly you wouldn't be knighted for doing math well. You get knighted because you do a service to the king. You kill some people, you fight in a war, you do a special service to the king. But he's getting knighted because he's being recognized for his contribution to humanity, which is a totally different thing. He wrote the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. He was multilingual, and that document that he created is largely considered one of the greatest achievements in writing of all time, up there with Plato's Republic, and documents like the American Constitution, which we'll talk about today. That's how profound the effect of it was. In the past, things like, the Common Book of Prayer, or the English Common Book of Prayer, or the King James Version of the Bible would be the only books that would have that level of influence. But this is not. This is him explaining how nature and science can help us understand the world through calculation. It's a pretty amazing achievement. He was also one of the two people that created a system for doing calculus, which is a subject I really detest. But despite the fact that he had this certainty and understanding of the world that nobody else had ever achieved, he nonetheless was an Anglican and remained faithful to the church and to God throughout his experimentation and understanding of the universe. And I think he set an example for American culture in his behavior, because there's a lot of Americans who are really famous scientists, including right up to Einstein, who still would not let go of the idea that God exists. Einstein famously would say, God does not play dice with the universe. And I mean, that is a kind of holdover from medieval culture. And it for the most part, British intellectuals would sort of distance themselves from that, firm belief that God is still running the universe. But Isaac Newton did not. And in the 18th century, 100 years later, when America becomes a country, they actually start the country without very much religious influence. But shortly after the country is created, there's something called the Great Awakening, which causes religion to make a comeback. So America becomes more religious, and still is more religious to this day than British culture is. So he totally realigned everybody's perspective on not just how English culture, British culture, or American culture work, but how the universe works. It's a very, very influential individual, and that's why he needs to be here and included. Now, John Locke. John Locke was, a philosopher as well, and often he's seen as the father of liberalism, the idea where everybody has certain rights and freedom is fundamental to his point of view. He believed that the way that we understand the world is through our senses, not through our mind or not through communication with God or through education by more, people who are more attuned to cultural influence, but that we are born and we are impressionable by the environment, and that we are basically a blank slate, what he called a tabula rasa, that our entire consciousness and beings that have certain things about us are consistent, like we have arms and legs and hair and a head and a brain, and these things he recognized. But essentially he thought the human mind, when a human was born, that they were the environment would determine how they turned out, which was not really something that the Protestant point of view believed in, because the Scottish Church, the one that's popular in Korea, the Presbyterian Church, believed in predestination, which meant that God had already chosen whether you would be a good person or a bad person, or whether you go to heaven or hell, and whatever you did in your life would not matter. It would not change the predetermined fact that you were chosen or not. But John Locke obviously didn't believe this. So England is fundamentally a conservative country. It doesn't like, if it changes, it doesn't like quick change. It's not a revolutionary culture. That's why the English Civil War is so important to study, because that was revolutionary. But the fact is that as soon as England engaged in that full-blown change in its society, and its country was ripped apart by radicalism, their reaction to it 10 years later was to invite the king back, the king's son, and create a new king, and correct the overreaction that the revolution needed to be pulled back from. And that's why the Peasants' Revolt and the Revolution and other moments in British culture, we don't call them revolutions, because they don't complete the job the way that the Cultural Revolution in China did, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. They whenever it looks like it's going to go too far, there's a correction and they pull back away. So it's essentially a conservative culture. That's why Evolution and Revolution is the title of the book, because it's in British culture especially. It's more about taking steps, not about completely changing the society in one revolutionary moment. So John Locke's influence was profound, especially when it comes to like organization of religious, political, financial, and social changes. He applied his philosophy to life and society and the way humans interacted with each other. So he had these ideas, about, he didn't agree with the idea that the king had absolute power and he was chosen by God. He thought that there should be a balance between expertise and representation and individual rights. And so he came up with some ideas, and literally when South Carolina decided to make its colony, they hired John Locke as a consultant. And his conclusion was that the best thing to do was to sort of create a council called the proprietors, who would have the most power, and they would run the colony. And then at the second level, there would be an elected group, much like the Congress in the United States, the legislative branch, and that there would be a balance between this group of like 10 or 20, powerful government officials that would run the country, kind of like a board of directors in a company. They were called the proprietors, which means owners. And the second level would be this elected group. And then the third level would be just all the other people, the majority. And they wouldn't have any influence over running the entire colony, but just only be chosen for, jury duty or officiating at a local level. That was his idea, and it was applied, and basically everybody got sick of the high council elite group of the proprietors not running the government the way that they wanted. And so they decided to abolish John Locke's experiment and become part of the British Empire. And then, of course, later they would revert back to some sort of republican system when they joined the Revolutionary War on the side of the American colonies, and they became independent. So John Locke had a very big influence on, his ideas about natural rights that all human beings have, and the fact that everything needs to be logical and based on the understanding of the world and the environment. These ideas were very important when Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, right? So, the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, which is derived from that, it starts out, "We the people." It's such an important document. In the textbook, there is a description of it, and I'll read a short piece of it right here. So what is the Constitution? It is a document that actually came from previous documents that Massachusetts and Virginia and other states had created, and they sort of combined all these ideas into one thing. This is what it says in the textbook. "Enshrined in this document are the constitutional rights of American citizens and the responsibilities and limitations of the government of the people. It has been amended many times, and it fell short of protecting certain people's rights in many ways." This is true. "In addition to racial and gender discrimination in the Constitution is a clear class discrimination that excluded many loyal British colonists as well. Still, at its heart, it still contained the principles that elevated the new republic above the conditions of any other 18th century Western state. In that sense, it was truly revolutionary." So basically, it turned out that it wasn't as, from our perspective, it didn't go far enough. It didn't free the slaves. It didn't give the vote to women. It didn't recognize minorities. If you wanted to vote, you had to own property. Think about all of you students. At what point would you be able to vote? When you bought a house or when you owned some land? Only then would you be allowed to vote. And if you're a woman, you would not be allowed. And let's just say it's a Korean system, so if you're not Korean, you wouldn't be allowed either. This would mean that for Korean men, the only people that had the chance to vote in Korea, you would probably, unless your parents were rich, you would have to work for a long time, save your money, and then buy even a small apartment, and then you would be eligible to vote. Most of you would be like 35 before you vote. But you just have to understand that at the time, countries didn't vote at all. There's places all over the world that have autocrats, dictators, kings, emperors. Like, there's places all over the world that nobody gets to vote for anything. So when America does this and a few million people get to vote because they're men and they're white and they own property, it's an improvement over nothing. Which is that's one perspective of looking at it. The other perspective, of course, is the one that most people take now. It's just like, what were they doing, denying 97% of the population the right to vote? That's discrimination right there. And basically, it says right away that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are natural rights, that everybody has that. And voting is a natural right for all people. But some of the colonies in the States still relied on slaves for their wealth and for their production and for their economy and for their life. And the society was not ready to deal with when they get emancipated by Abraham Lincoln, they're freed legally or constitutionally, I guess you could say. The announcement is made by the president. It's an official, but in reality, what do you do if you're a slave and you're fed by your master and you live in the house and then they free you and where do you go? You don't have an education. You're not going to get hired and paid properly because there's still racism everywhere. So there is another problem tied up in the institution of slavery, is that when you abolish slavery, you have to do something to take care of the 2 million people that you removed from Africa and put in America. You can't just set them free and say, okay, good luck, take care of yourselves in the mountains, in the forest, in the winter with no food. You have to do something, to help them. And this is what I think, other than the just blatant racism and exploitation of people, and the fact that, okay, black people, African people look different. So like if a white slave ran away or a native slave ran away, they could blend in easily with another group. But if you're just completely racist and you say all of these people are slaves, and if you find somebody who's not working and is not staying on their plantation with a master, that person has to be captured and returned to where they belong. This is what drove the racism that became part of the system. Slavery has been a part of many countries all over the place, but it was the fact that it was easier to chase down, capture, and prevent slaves from rebelling or from hiding or escaping. That drove racism further into the American culture, which, it culminated in a civil war. That's how severe some people still in America, you've probably seen it on the news and how people behave, and with the small things that the president says can set off people's behavior. It's because, the system, American system, has elements of it that are still racist. It hasn't been fixed yet. So this is what page 147 is discussing, moving forward to the end of chapter 4, so that we can conclude today at the end of chapter 4, and you can just study all the stuff we talked about from the beginning of the Hard Fork, chapter 4, and how I explained, 17th century British colonialism in America. We went through all that on Zoom, and then we've had 2 lectures here. All of this information is going to be on the quiz. So it says on page 147, America in shackles. Slavery is a dehumanizing, undignified system of forced labor without consent or payment. There's compensation, obviously, clothing, but it can be just the minimum requirements, sort of the bottom of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, where you just provide food, clothing, shelter, and that's it. You don't provide any social context or leisure or any other incentives. You just have to keep those people healthy and make them work. That's the only motivation. It's pretty much the worst kind of exploitation, and it's not just restricted to actual slavery where you have chains on you, but we do have certain types of slavery that continue to this day, like sweatshops, when a company pays $1 a day for people to make dozens of shoes, and then they sell those shoes for $150 a piece. You're basically using the same level of exploitation, just you're not controlling their life, but you're only giving them enough to subsist. You're only giving them enough. So there's various types of slavery, but in a way, American slavery is the worst because it's based on racial color lines, and it's the kind of slavery that we call chattel slavery, where you literally chain people to things and abuse them in order to keep them working. So many slavery is a human institution that has existed since societies started to develop. We've had slavery for thousands of years, but we would think that by now education and morality had evolved to the point where we aren't doing this stuff anymore. But in some places it still exists. This is the contradiction, though, is that the high-minded effort of the Constitution basically points towards the idea that we're trying to create equality, and we're trying to. Everybody has opportunity. Some people can be rich. Some people are poor, but you don't suppress the people and not allow them to ascend. And there should be social and political freedom. And this is basically the idea of the Constitution, but it ends up being blocked by rich politicians who are invested in keeping people out of regular society. So they dehumanize. They make it so that slaves are not actual human beings according to the Constitution. Their owner can vote on their behalf because they represent 3/5 of a person. It's a very odd solution to this, but basically you get more votes if you own slaves, which seems completely backwards. You're going to take votes away from your slaves and give them to yourself so that you can vote to keep them in slavery. It's completely, there's no logic to this thing. However, this is how they solve the problem of, in the South, there's a lower population, and the lower population wants to be represented, what they say, fairly, right? They want to have as much political influence over the country as the non-slave states, which have higher populations of voters. So if you're a slave owner, you actually get to vote more, not less. And the people that want to be free, that you're taking care of, or I shouldn't say taking care of, the ones that you're oppressing, they actually have to give their rights over to you. It's a terrible solution to a political problem between the North and the South. And it won't last very long. It takes about 3 generations of this to happen before the Civil War, the things start to unravel, and the Civil War is obviously going to happen. This is the reality of the slave trade, which sometimes we call the triangle trade, because it did make England very wealthy, and they did abolish slavery in the early 19th century, and America continued, but that was after several hundred years of making money by taking finished goods, guns, weapons, tools, cloth that is being produced in England down to Africa and trading them for slaves or capturing slaves, and then going across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and South America and North America and selling them to the plantation owners there, and then picking up cultivated goods like cotton, sugar, coffee, indigo, rice, etc., and then bringing it back. And this is the triangular trade, and people made obscene amounts of money. Like, people talk about bank accounts paying 1% or 2% now, or if you buy a stock, you might double your money. If you buy a stock, your stock goes up fast, and a few months later, you might make 100% if you're lucky. But these people are making, when they do this route in their ships, and they bring the goods from Europe, manufactures goods, they sell it in Africa, and then they transport human beings across the ocean, sell them there, and then they pick up. They're doing trade at each corner of the triangle, and they bring back the resources from the New World to England, and the cycle continues. They're making ridiculous amounts of money, 700, 800% each voyage. So you think about Beck-Manoan, you put it in the bank, and then next year it comes out and it's PAL Beck-Manoan. This is one of the reasons why people, even though they knew it was a horrible crime against human beings, they continued to do it because it was just so profitable. And this is one of the things that historians also say about American culture, is that they're still in denial about the fact that America was, African Americans produced more goods and did more labor than the white people did. Their population grew faster. Like, this is what America's infrastructure and its wealth was built on African Americans, and they still haven't seen much of that, the fruits of their generations of sacrifice. So when it's hard to argue when rich white Americans say, well, that was a long time ago, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, because for hundreds of years you exploited these people and they got nothing from it, and you're still rich now because of that contribution, right? Arguably, you could say America was built on the backs of African American slaves more than it was on the back of free labor. So what does that mean to American culture? That they imagine themselves to be free and democratic, but the whole society, the whole superpower status and the development and the infrastructure and the wealth that America possesses now ultimately is derived from what we would characterize now as, a crime against humanity. Here we go. I'm going to read this, and then I think that's enough dark talk for today. The U.S. election hasn't been concluded. You're probably not as nervous as Canadians and Americans are, but everybody's on edge today. So let's just talk about the historical problems that are inherent one more time. The transatlantic slave trade, a segment of the global slave trade that transported between 10 and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century, was immense. It was the second of three stages of the so-called triangular trade, in which arms, textiles, and wine were shipped from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and sugar and coffee from the Americas to Europe. Probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas before 1600. However, in the 17th century, demand for slave labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake, which is Virginia, region in North America. The largest numbers of slaves were taken to the Americas during the 18th century, which is the one we're talking about now, when, according to historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. Encyclopedia Britannica. As I've said to you before, that's not an encyclopedia, it's not an official source, but that is such a good summary it's such a good description of what the slave trade represents. 3/5. So, we're talking about 9 million or 10 million of these people being transported in 100 years. And that was in the century that the Americans fought to be free of the British Empire, but they didn't take the slaves with them. They continued the institution on their own. We will talk about the Civil War. That's in 2 weeks. And we will, of course, end up in the 20th century towards the end of the class when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, which is a clear indication, and of the protests this year. All of those things are a clear indication that the Constitution was not a perfect document, and it was somewhat ambitious, but it fell far short of being fair to a huge portion of the American population, which was African American. So now things still need to be amended and corrected. The process is still ongoing, and we shouldn't forget that. That is all the material that you need to know for the quiz. So please read over the sections that I covered today and check your notes about the Zoom lecture, because a lot of that material isn't in the book. So I hope you were listening in the Zoom lecture, because there will be several questions on the quiz related to pre-Revolutionary War events. So that is all. Now remember those key ideas I talked about to you as well, right? That Dr. Alan Gelzo shared with me in his lectures. The important things in the United States: freedom, education, popular government, the right of people to rule themselves, the interest in experimentation, and belief in themselves, the confidence in themselves. And you can add to that what I just said today. This is going to be an ongoing theme for the rest of the class when we talk about American culture, is contradiction. Okay, thank you everybody for listening, and enjoy your weekend. Remember, video lecture next Monday and next Thursday, and don't forget, you have a quiz next Thursday at 10.